We're now going to look at one of Ireland's favourite crops, the potato. Um, First of all, classifying your potatoes. So potatoes are in the Solanaceae family. Other examples of Solanaceae would include your tobacco and tomatoes. We call it a root crop. It's classified as a root crop, even though in actual fact it's a stem tuber, which means that it's an underground stem that swells with food to be stored over the winter, because the potato would naturally have a 2-year growth cycle. Here's a picture of a potato tuber, and just to draw your attention to a couple of little things here. So here is the part of the potato from here on up is the part of the potato that you'll see above the ground. So that's what we see in a potato field. And it can have some white flowers on it, probably in May if you're talking about your first earlies, and a little bit later for the rest of your potatoes. We'll get onto that in a little while. And then you can see that there's lots of little roots coming out here, little thready looking roots. And these guys here are called stolons, and they're coming out from the bottom of the shoot as well, underground. And each of those stolons has an actual potato tuber growing at the end of it. So there's your potato tuber. Now, potatoes are popular, I call this slide. We love our potatoes in Ireland. We've had a long history with them, and in spite of the fact that they let us down there when we had a few years of blight and ended up having a famine, we still eat potatoes. Most Irish households actually buy potatoes very regularly, or at least once a week. We have approximately 9,500 hectares planted under potatoes in Ireland at the moment. It varies year to year, but it would always be in the 9,000 plus. The counties that are mainly involved would be Wexford and Cork are great for the early potatoes because they're coastal regions, and we'll come to that in a little bit. Dublin is also a huge producer. Throw a little word in there for Rogers potatoes, produced in Dublin. Fine potatoes altogether. Meath, not too bad either, and Donegal. Donegal is mainly used for producing seed potatoes, and there are a good few reasons for that. And really and truly, you can grow potatoes in a lot of places in Ireland if you're looking for main crop potatoes. But if you're looking for the early ones, you're talking probably Wexford and Cork are good for the earlies, and Dublin's not too bad. Oops. So the growth cycle of potatoes. So potatoes go through 5 stages in their growth. The first stage is sprout development, and if you've ever seen your potatoes, the little eyes on the potatoes, those eyes are where you will get sprouts developing, and the sprouts are little shoots that grow out of the eyes, and they grow upwards through the soil, and then roots come out from the bottom of the emerging sprouts, and they grow downwards in the soil. The second stage is called vegetative growth. So at this stage, once your shoot gets out of the soil, you get leaves and a stem developing. At the same time, what's going on under the soil? You have some roots and some stolons developing under the soil. Obviously enough, once you get the leaves out of the soil, they're going to be able to do photosynthesis, and that's going to lead to an increase in the dry matter in the potato plant. So then the next stage is tuber initiation. So the tuber is the bit we're interested in. That's the actual potato that we end up eating. So the tubers begin to form down at the bottom at the tips of the stolon, and I showed you that on a picture earlier. At that point, you start to get flowers on your potato plant, and as I mentioned, you could be seeing those now at around May time if you're talking about your first earlies, and they might be a little bit later for your main crop potatoes. After that, then the tuber starts to bulk out, so the photosynthesis is producing your sugars and starches, and all of those nutrients start to be sent to the tuber at this stage, and the tuber starts to grow down under the soil. And And finally, maturation. So at this stage, you'll see that the leaves start to turn yellow, and that's when your photosynthesis starts to drop off. And then the tuber will be fully mature at this stage, so it won't grow that much more either. Um, you've reached your optimum dry matter by now, and the only thing that really happens after that is that the potato skins start to harden. And just to mention that your first early potatoes, your new potatoes that we would call them in Ireland, would be harvested before maturation. So they'd be harvested during the tuber bulking, actually before the tubers get very big, but certainly before the maturation stage where the skin starts to harden. So soil suitability. Just like our other crops, we're going to go through the stages in growing potatoes. So we'll start with the soil, then we look at your cultivations, what you need to do in order to prepare the soil for sowing the potatoes. Then after that, we look at the fertilizer requirements when you're growing potatoes. Then we look at your weed control and your pest and fungus control. And then finally, we look at the steps involved in harvesting and storage. So first of all, let's look at the soil suitability. Your potatoes love a deep, well-drained soil. A medium to heavy loam is great, and you'd love to have very few stones in it. That might be hard to get, but if you haven't got many stones, then you won't get much bruising in the potatoes when you're harvesting them. Potatoes like a pH of 5.5 to 6. Lower than 5 would need a bit of correction. But if your potato pH was too high, then you'll encounter another difficulty, and that is called potato scab. So you would never grow your potatoes on soil that has just been limed, because if the pH is too high, you would increase the likelihood of getting potato scab. So the ideal place for your first earlies would be on a lovely south-facing, gently sloping field, because they'll get the best of the sun, and the gently sloping will make sure that it's well drained as well. The soil must be frost-free, so that's why you tend to get your first early potatoes in the likes of Wexford and Cork, the coastal regions. It's also one of the factors that makes Donegal suitable for producing seed potatoes. Main crop potatoes, though, you could even grow them in Limerick. They could be grown on most soils in Ireland and in most locations. Now, so I've used the terms early, new potato, and main crop, but what did I actually mean by those terms? Well, we classify our potatoes into three groups. We have our first earlies, our second earlies, and our main crop potatoes. So under the heading of first earlies, you have potatoes like your Home Guard and your Epicure. Then your second earlies would include the Maris Piper and my own personal favourite, the British Queens. And then your main crop would include things like the Rooster and the Golden Wonder. Why are they called first early, second early, and main crop? It's to do with the time of year that you harvest them. So your first earlies tend to be harvested in late May, early June, and for a few weeks there the country goes wild looking for the first earlies, and the price of those potatoes is really high. The second earlies come on a little bit later, so you're talking about late June and July for your second earlies, and then your main crop potatoes basically August on. And those main crop potatoes are going to keep you going then all the way around until May of the following year, when you start to get your your first earlies again. Right, so first earlies then. We call them new potatoes as well, and you need to get them into the ground early, so they can be planted as early as February. Now in Ireland we have difficulties with planting in February. Often our soil is very waterlogged and just not suitable for cultivation in February. But down in Limerick certainly, you want to get your potatoes in before St. Patrick's Day. So always they'd be aiming to beat each other by getting their potatoes sown as early as possible. knowing that a week at the start of June can make you a huge percentage of your profit for the year, because you can sell the potatoes at any price you want at that stage. Um, they tend to be harvested from May onwards, kind of late May, early June. They're harvested immature. What I mean by that is they tend to be quite small. They haven't reached their full dry matter content. They haven't reached their full weight, and they certainly haven't had time for their skins to harden up on the outside. So you'll notice your new potatoes tend to have not very well formed skin. The skin will even peel off them. So very thin skin that will actually peel off them, and they tend to be small. But we want them small. They tend to taste really nice. Um, these have to be grown in frost-free coastal regions because you're trying to sow them early. So if you were setting potatoes in February in the Midlands, you could get frost certainly in February, in March, even in April in the Midlands. Whereas if you're in Wexford, you tend not to get frost after February, so you'd get away with sowing your potatoes earlier. As I mentioned, they tend to have a low yield, so they don't get very big, they don't weigh much, but you get great high prices for them, which more than makes up for that low yield. Examples would include Homeguard and Epicure. I'm not that familiar with Epicure. Homeguard is a really nicely tasted potato, and it bulks out fairly well in comparison to some others, and it's fairly high yielding. It is though susceptible to drought, so if you get a dry late spring, it can really affect the development of your Homeguard and how soon they'll be bigger than marbles and you'll be able to get in there and harvest them. So your second earlies. Your second earlies are also sown in February, but they're left in the ground that little bit longer, so they get that little bit bigger, and that means that you don't harvest them until July. If they get that little bit bigger, then you get a higher yield, obviously enough. They tend to have higher or better eating qualities and keeping qualities. Well, it depends on what you're after. They get a lower price. What I mean by keeping qualities there is that when you get your first earlies, you pretty much have to buy them and eat them in a couple of days, preferably on the day you buy them, whereas your second earlies will last a little bit longer. So they'll keep a little bit longer. We don't mean you can put them into storage for a couple of weeks or anything, but they'll last more than a couple of days. You'll get a lower price for your second earlies, and one of my favourite potatoes comes under the heading of second early. That's the British Queen. It's a beautifully tasted potato. It is drought resistant in comparison to some of the first earlies, certainly. Now, it would be very susceptible to blight, but generally what we do in Limerick is we harvest our queens quite early. So if you can harvest those in June, they're small, but you're getting them out of the ground before there's any chance of blighty weather, which will be coming up on a later slide. So other examples, the Dunbar Rover, Estima, Willia I've never heard of myself, but Maris Piper is another fairly common one. Maris Piper is it's a decent quality potato. It can be used for making chips quite successfully, especially if you have one of those air fryers, because it tends to be a fairly starchy potato for one of the earlies. It has good keeping qualities, your Maris Piper. So those are your second earlies. And moving on then to the main crop potatoes. Now, main crop potatoes are done as part of your second sowing, so they're not sown until April, and they will be harvested then from late August into September probably, and they are late maturing, so you let them get to full maturity, these potatoes. They give you a high yield, and they keep better than any of the others that we've studied up until now, which means that they can be stored for the whole winter and eaten all the way up until the following May, if you give them the right conditions for storage. Examples of these would be your Kerpinks, or Kerr's Pink as they should be called, your Records, Roosters, and Golden Wonders. All of those are fine, solid potatoes. They tend to be more floury and have a higher dry matter content than the earlies that we were talking about earlier. Um, your Golden Wonders haven't got as high a yield as the Roosters, but they have very high dry matter content. And then your Roosters are the reddish looking ones that we looked at earlier, which I bet you're all very familiar with. These reddish looking ones here are Roosters. And those Roosters are an exceptionally hardy, I suppose, good for storage potato. They can tolerate being stored over the whole winter and still give you good, solid, firm potatoes the following March, April, May. On the other hand, you'd have some potato growers that pretty much resent growing their roosters, um, including some of the major producers who are producing probably over 50% of their product is roosters. They'd still nearly spit when they're saying the name rooster because it's a very poorly regarded potato in comparison to the likes of your British Queens that have much nicer taste, and your Kerpinks even. The rooster, some potato growers will go, oh yeah, it's grand for making chips. However, it continues to be one of the highest selling potatoes in Ireland, and will keep going as one of the highest selling potatoes in Ireland, I'd say, for a long time to come. I think the statistic at the moment is that it accounts for about 55 or 56% of all potato production. So those are your main crop potatoes. Factors to consider then when you're choosing a variety of potatoes, if you're going to go growing potatoes. You need to think about the consumer's choice. So what does the consumer want? As I said to you, some of the potato snobs literally would hate to say the word rooster, they call them those red things. However, they'll all grow them because they are in demand in the shops. And the yield that you'll get, if you have a higher yielding potato, then you're going to have more potato to sell and probably make more money, with the exception of your first earlies that you can charge a high price for. The eating quality. So certain potatoes are more highly prized by certain groups of people, and I'll come to a little bit more on that in a little while. And the keeping quality, which refers in particular to the main crop potatoes, how do they perform in storage? Disease resistance, always very important, and we'll be studying the diseases a little bit later on another slide. And seed availability, not so much an issue in Ireland because we only have a certain number of potatoes that we really focus on, and we tend to have plenty of those seeds, but could become an issue if you were growing a particular variety that wasn't very common. So eating quality, just to focus in on that for a minute, you'll hear your parents describe potatoes as floury or soapy. So soapy potatoes are potatoes that are kind of moist and firm. They tend to be more popular in Europe than they are in Ireland. We like our potatoes floury, with the exception of our new potatoes or our earlies. We don't mind those being a little bit more solid, a little bit harder, a little bit soapier, but we generally don't like to have too high a water content in our potatoes. We prefer the floury ones. They're the drier, fluffier potatoes. They tend to go down better in Ireland. So three of our very popular varieties there, the Record, the Kerpinks and the Golden Wonders, would all tend more towards the flourier or fluffier side of your eating quality. Now, how do we grow our potatoes? So first of all, cultivating the soil. We'll start with autumn ploughing if you can, and certainly you'll need to plough deep in spring to a depth of 22 to 25 centimetres. Now that's because potatoes end up being planted quite deep. So if you're going to plant them quite deep, you'll need to plough the soil quite deeply. After that then, you'll use a heavy duty cultivator like a power rotavator or a power harrow. There you could use a one run harrow which as a disc harrow, ridge harrow, and soil crumbler to produce a lovely fine seed bed with all the major clods broken down, and also a seed bed that's deep enough, and it'll do all of that without compacting your soil. Then you'll need to de-stone, or certainly your commercial grower would always de-stone at that stage. If you're growing your potatoes for domestic use like I am, you can go and pick the stones out of your potato by hand. But your commercial de-stoner will run along, and it looks like a potato harvester essentially, and it is picking them up out of the soil and then leaving them in a line of stones. And as I said, you can also do that by hand. Now, then the ridges are formed, and a ridge is basically a raised area of soil, and that's where you're going to put in your seed potato. The ridges tend to be maybe 75 to 90 centimetres wide, and they would want to be about 15 centimetres deep. Why do you want wide ridges? Well, that gives plenty of soil around the tubers when they're developing, and means that there's less chance of the tubers getting out to the outside of the ridge and coming into contact with sunlight. Because if they do get into contact with sunlight, they can turn green. It'll also lessen the compaction, and it'll lead to a greater yield, and it'll prevent the seed from any waterlogging as well. So sowing the seed, then you sow it with a potato planter, which is basically just a specialised seed drill. And there you can see a picture of a potato planter. And as I mentioned, they have to be sown to a depth of about 10 centimetres. Now, excuse me, that should say 25 to 35 centimetres apart. How far apart you plant your seed potatoes depends on the size of the seed potato. Generally, if you've bigger seed potatoes with more eyes on them, then you'll get more of these side buds, and that'll end up with more potatoes. And I mentioned already that you plant them 10 centimetres deep so that the sunlight can't get at them, because if it does, it causes greening of the potatoes, which means that you'll have these chemicals called alkaloids building up in the potatoes, and they could actually give you a bit of a sick stomach if you eat them. So this table here shows the spacing that you would use for your potatoes. So if the potato seed is in the region of 35 to 45 millimetres, so your seed potato, if it's that size, you will space them out 20 to 25 centimetres. Whereas if your seed potato is that bit bigger, 45 to 55 millimetres, you'll space them out by about a foot, 30 to 35 centimetres. And then that will dictate how many seeds you'll be planting per hectare. So at that higher size of seed potato, you will be sowing about 40,000 per hectare. You always want to get a uniform spacing so that they have the optimum growth conditions, a good lot of space to use. So usually you're using about 2.5 tons of seed potato per hectare. You make sure that you use certified seed if possible. And before you seed, you carry out a procedure called sprouting or chitting. Now, the advantages of sprouting your potatoes are that your potato plant will emerge quicker, so you'll have earlier emergence. It will start growing earlier, and if it starts growing earlier, you'll get a higher yield when you harvest your potatoes. But what do I mean by sprouting or chitting? Sprouting potatoes means that you put them in a shallow sprouting box. Now, if you were doing this on a domestic scale at home, you might line them up in egg boxes, and you place them in a greenhouse at a temperature of about 5.5 degrees, and you place them in the light. And the light then promotes a little sprout coming out of the eyes of the potatoes, and that sprout you'd like it to get to about 2.5 centimetres or so before you plant the potatoes. Every eye has the potential to grow into an individual plant, so the more eyes on the potatoes, the more plants you will get off the potatoes. Um, so large tubers, large seed potatoes will have more chits or more little sprouts coming out of them, and therefore you will get a higher yield. So the benefits again of sprouting your potatoes, you can increase the yield by more than 5 tonnes, and you have to do it for your first earlies. So if you want a chance of harvesting your potatoes early when that new potato market is at its height and you can charge what you like for them, you'd need to be chitting or sprouting your potatoes. So again, you put them into little individual sprouting boxes, or as I said, egg cartons will do you at home, and you place them somewhere where the light can get at them at a temperature of about 5.5, so not too warm because you don't want them to actually go off. And you leave them there for a few weeks before you plant them, and it has given them a kind of a head start when you plant them. So here is a picture of some chitted potatoes with little sprouts coming out of them. Personally, I prefer my little sprouts to be a bit greener than those ones, but anyway. Now, another thing that you can do to kind of speed up the growth of the potatoes would be to use some plastic. So if you cover your early potatoes in plastic, it means that you will get to harvest them earlier, and you can get a higher yield of maybe even 1 or 2 tonnes higher. The plastic gives them a frost protection and increases the soil temperature under the plastic, and that's how you can achieve that earlier and higher yield. Now, when you're planting your potatoes, you need to think about fertiliser. Generally, you would like somebody to do a soil test to find out what are the actual needs of the soil. So what is the soil index for nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium? And you'd like that to dictate the amount of fertiliser spread and the type of fertiliser spread. But the typical tends to be nitrogen at around 150 kilograms per hectare, phosphorus around 150 kilograms per hectare as well, and then potassium at about 300 kilograms per hectare. So you'll notice there that you have a 1:1 ratio in your nitrogen and phosphorus, and then is to 2 in your potassium. And that brings us to the names of some common fertilizers that would be used, and 10-10-20 you'll see satisfies that ratio. 10-10-20 is a good general all-round fertilizer for growing any vegetable really, and it has its use for potatoes. 7-6-17 is a more targeted potato fertilizer, if you like, and the 17 there refers to, if you remember, you have your nitrogen, your phosphorus and your potassium. So the first number is the ratio of nitrogen, the second one is the phosphorus, and the third one is the potassium. And potassium is generally higher in your potato fertilizers because it will lead to a heavier weight in your tuber, a nice filled out solid looking tuber at the end of the growth cycle. You may use sulfate of potash as your potassium source, and sometimes potatoes can benefit from farmyard manure, which will just increase the organic matter in the soil and will mean that the soil will hold its water better. So if you are growing your potatoes in a kind of a sandy loam that might just lose too much water, if you had long dry drought periods, adding some manure might benefit that, give it a better water holding capacity. So the fertiliser then is applied either as a broadcast fertiliser, and you have a broadcast spreader there on the right, and that is just broadcast over the top of the soil before you form your drills, because then when you form your drills you're mixing it into the soil effectively, or you can do it when you're opening the drills as well. Your commercial growers will actually put 2 bands of fertiliser kind of either side of the drill, and the benefit of putting those 2 bands of fertiliser, one either side of the potato drill, is that the potato gets a uniform distribution of the fertilizer. So it has great access to fertilizer on both sides, and that makes the potato grow more uniformly. And it means that you're not wasting fertilizer in places that it's not needed either. It's a more even application of fertilizer, so it's more cost effective too. Then, what are the different components in the fertilizer actually used for? I should mention first of all that fertilizers without chlorine are preferable because um, chlorine will inhibit the formation of the dry matter, so you'll get a kind of a soapy, watery, wet potato. So what does the nitrogen do? Well, the nitrogen increases yields. Nitrogen leads to good leaf development in your potato plant, which, if you've good leaf development, then you've lots of photosynthesis, and if you've lots of photosynthesis, then you've lots of carbohydrate making, which should increase your yield. However, if you've excess nitrogen, it actually decreases the dry matter, so you get a kind of a wetter potato, and it can also lead to blight susceptibility. The more leaf you have, the more susceptible you are to getting blight on the leaf, because blight is caused by a fungus that first of all lands on the leaf. Then what about your phosphorus? Phosphorus is great for rooting, and that's why phosphorus is an essential component really for any vegetable fertilizer that you have, or for many horticultural uses as well. Even if you're planting trees, a little bit of extra phosphorus is no harm to promote root development. It also increases the dry matter. Potassium then increases the tuber size, so that's your actual yield, and that's why potassium is very important in your potatoes. So it increases the potato size and therefore increases the yield, and it increases dry matter content, and it even adds to the eating quality of the potatoes as well, so it gives them a kind of a nice floury taste. Now, potato rotation then. So how often should you plant potatoes in a particular field? Potatoes shouldn't be planted more than 1 year in 4. So you need a good solid rotation, and they are the root part of the rotation. So generally you might put them in after a lay, because if you do, then you'll have good humus in the soil when you plough it in, and having good humus can lead to higher yields and also to nice strong skin on the potatoes. I should mention that if you were growing your seed potatoes, the controls are even stricter for growing seed potatoes, so you'd only have a 1 in 5 rotation there. Which brings me nicely to our certified seed, and we've mentioned this a few times already. Your certified seed will be used to get greater germination rates and greater purity. Now, seed potatoes are primarily grown in Donegal, well, exclusively actually grown in Donegal, and the reason for that is, twofold. First of all, you have your climate. The climate in Donegal is cool and windy, and that's well suited to the growth of potatoes. And also windy in particular is important because aphids or greenfly don't like windy conditions, and if you don't get much greenfly, then you're avoiding some of the viruses that those greenfly can carry. So the aphids transmit a lot of serious viral diseases, so if you can keep the aphid population low by growing them in windy conditions, then your seed potatoes have a much better chance of being free from any of those viral diseases. Donegal's a coastal area as well, which means that it'll have less frost, which we've said already that potatoes are very susceptible to frost. And a very important one, Donegal is miles away from anywhere else in the country where we grow potatoes, and that means that there's much lower chance of any disease being transmitted from other areas of growth into your seed potatoes that are growing in Donegal, so it's isolated from the other places that potatoes are grown. So certified seeds then are produced in accordance with certain procedures, and they centre around selection, initial propagation and further propagation. Now, some of this is slightly beyond the material of the course, so we'll go fairly quickly through it. So selection, first of all, the potatoes to be used as seed must come from fields that are completely free from the potato cyst nematode. More on that later. It is a terrible pest of potatoes. They are also strictly tested for 3 other principal diseases of potatoes: your virus Y, your leaf roll, and leaf mosaic disease. This seed is selected from farms in Donegal for the reasons that we mentioned earlier that have been selected by the DAFM. Now, then the initial propagation, they're grown under strict growing conditions in high elevation windy nucleus plots, they're called in Donegal, or they could be micro-propagated in labs. These plots are strictly controlled and are isolated from one another. The growing vegetation is regularly tested to see in case there's been any viral infections. Then once you have them, once you finish your initial propagation, once enough seed is available, it's distributed to selected growers around the country and propagated further, again in isolated supervised conditions, and all the while it is being tested to make sure that there aren't any diseases in it. And when this final propagation is finished, those potatoes are sold as seed potatoes to farmers all around the country. They're not really seeds when you think about it. They're actually immature tubers, so they're year 1 tubers that haven't been allowed to get very big. That means that they are part of an asexual reproduction, which will make sense to those of you who are doing biology. The quality of the new plant then will be identical to the parent plant because it is produced asexually, and this certified seed can only be grown in a 1 in 5 rotation, meaning you can only grow it in the same field 1 year out of every 5. So what are the advantages of using certified seed? Just to revisit that, the seed has a high percentage germination, it has a better rate of establishment, gives a higher yield, fewer weeds, it's true to type, so it's pure is the other way of saying that. You'll have fewer pests and diseases. It tends to have been treated with pesticide and fungicide, and it will be easier to market the crop when you can say it's been grown from certified seed. What are the disadvantages? Well, there's only one big disadvantage. It can be quite expensive, and for that reason you get a lot of growers that buy certified seed only every 2 or 3 years, and then they use that to make their own homegrown seed to keep them going in the interim years. However, you do have to buy certified seed at least 1 year out of every 3 just to reduce your problems with disease on your farm. So what do they do when they get that certified seed? They plant it in an isolated area of the farm as far away from the rest of the growing areas as possible. They spray it with pesticide and then they kill it early so that they get lots of the potato tubers within that size that you're looking for, maybe around your 35 millimeters or that way. Now we come to diseases, pests and weed control, and I'm afraid there's nothing for this but to learn it. So in each case we're going to look at the disease, what it's caused by, what are the symptoms, and what are the ways of controlling or preventing it. So the first one, leaf roll, it's a virus and it tends to be carried by greenfly or aphids. And the symptoms that you'll see: rolled leaves, so the leaves kind of roll up, and stunted growth in the plant. And to avoid that, you use certified seed. You shouldn't have any problem with that at all if you use certified seed. Leaf mosaic, similarly, it's a virus that's transmitted by aphids, and you get a kind of a speckly look on the leaves and again stunted growth, and you avoid it by using certified seed. Blackleg. Now, blackleg is an interesting one. It is caused by a bacterium called Pectobacterium carotivorium, and it causes soft rot in the tubers as well. The lower stem on the potato plant goes black, and it can also, as I said, infect tubers during storage, and if it does, those tubers will go black. It's more common if you have a bit of waterlogging, and in cool, wet weather, the bacteria will multiply rapidly. So if we get a kind of a windy, wet spring, we'll have more problems with blackleg than if we had a drier spring, and particularly if you happen to be in a fairly waterlogged or poor draining soil. So the best way to avoid it would be to use, again, certified seed, and try not to grow potatoes in fields that aren't very well drained, and make sure that your potatoes are dry when they're being harvested, because if they are wet, that would again favour the growth of the bacteria. Gangrene, not a major one, but it's a fungus, caused by fungus, and you get deep dark coloured areas on the tubers, so on the potatoes themselves, and you can avoid it by using certified seed or spraying with fungicide. And potato scab then, that's a bacterial disease, and you'll notice scarring around the potato. They look like blotchy scars around the potato on the skin, and it actually goes through the skin into the potato then. How can you avoid it? By using certified seed. And we mentioned earlier that potato scab is much more common if the pH is too high in the soil. So you don't grow potatoes after liming or on soil that has a pH that's too high. Just a couple of little pictures here. Whoops, your blackleg. You can see the black area of stem down here at the bottom. You can also see the yellowing of the leaves. You can see some of them are dying off up here at the top. What else? Oops. Your quarantine diseases. So there are some diseases that we've been lucky enough not to get in Ireland yet, and two of those are brown rot and ring rot. And if you get those, they are what's called notifiable, which means you have to report them. And while we haven't got them yet in Ireland, we do have the plant in Ireland which is a host for the bacteria that causes them, and that's called woody nightshade. So it's one that the DAFM would be checking out for by doing inspections on our potato stock for signs of the disease. Now, preventing diseases then, well, if you're talking about fungal diseases, you can prevent them by spraying with fungicide every 7 to 10 days. And if you remember, we covered the 3 different types of fungicide before. You have your systemic, which goes to every part of the plant, regardless of what part it comes into contact with. You have your contact, which only kills the parts of the plant that it comes into direct contact with. And then your translaminar, where you spray it and it gets on the top of the leaves, but it gets transmitted down to the underside of the leaves as well and protects it. Viral diseases, if you want to kill those, the best way to kill viral diseases on potatoes is to get rid of the green fly. And you get rid of the green fly by spraying with pesticide. Now, potato blight, which is a terrible scourge of potato growers, both domestic and commercial. It's caused by a fungus called Phytophthora infestans. The symptoms would be browning around the edge of the leaf, and then eventually it goes necrotic, meaning it dies, it goes black, and rotting of the tubers as well. The life cycle of your fungus, it produces tiny little hyphae called haustoria, and these penetrate the cell walls in the leaf and break down and absorb the plant tissue, and that's what causes the brown patches. The haustoria then form things called sporangia, which produce little spores inside of them, and those spores can be spread on the wind from one plant to another. Potato blight can actually be spread from one grower to another across distances of up to probably 1.5 kilometres, I think a mile, 1.6 kilometres. Then what happens is that the the haulms, or basically the shoot system of the plant, dies early. And if it does, if your leaves and your stems, all the aerial parts of the plant have died, then you've nothing to make starch anymore, nothing to make your carbohydrate, and to send that carbohydrate down into the tuber, so you'll have a reduced yield. The blight spores also can be washed by rainfall actually down from the haulms down into the tubers, so down into the soil and then down into the tubers, and that's very bad news. If you see blight on your leaves, you are supposed to remove the stem entirely. Now, if you remove the stem entirely, you are stopping the growth of your tuber, of your potato. It's not going to get any bigger, but at least you're stopping the spread of the fungus from the leaf down into the tuber, down into the potato. So you can still eat those potatoes. They don't have the fungus in them. And typically we get potato blight towards the end of the growth cycle of the potatoes anyway. So while you're stopping their growth a little bit early, at least they'll have reached a reasonable size, hopefully, by the time we get into blighty weather. What do I mean by blighty weather? I mean warm, humid weather, which in Ireland we don't get really until probably July or August. So up until then, our first earlies never have a problem with blight because they're out of the ground before we get any bit of humidity. If you're taking them out of the ground in late May, early June, you've no problems with humidity there, so you're not likely to have any blight. Whereas really in July and August, you could have problems with humid, warm weather in Ireland, and therefore you might have blighty conditions. Here's a picture of the life cycle that I just went through there. So you'll see over here on the right hand side, you can see that this plant is infected. You can see a black tuber down there at the bottom, and you can see the black necrosis on the leaves. So the sporangiophore grows up out of the leaf, and it has little sporangia on the end of it. Zoosporangia on the end of it. Inside of those are your little spores, and those spores get released when they're mature, and then they can land on another leaf, and they can send down their little hyphae into the leaf and start feeding on the leaf. And this is what your infected leaf looks like. And eventually the infection will travel down through the shoot down into the tuber, or as we said earlier, it might be washed off the leaf down onto the earth and from there to the tuber. If you can earth up, which will be coming in a little while, meaning if you can put a good thick layer of soil here between the stem and down to the tuber, you can at least slow the progress of any blight that might attack your potatoes. So how do we prevent it? Well, first of all, you don't sow any seed that shows any sign of blight on it. Earthing up, which is a process that I'll be mentioning in a couple of slides here. Removing all the tubers. So when you're harvesting potatoes, it's really essential that you harvest all the potatoes. Don't leave any after you, because if you do, those can allow blight to overwinter in those tubers and be there ready for the next year when you're growing. What else then? You can spray with fungicide, and most commercial potato growers would spray every 10 days, maybe even 7 to 10 days if there's an actual blight warning. So you listen for those blight warnings on the radio, and when you get them, you spray with fungicide every 7 to 10 days until you're harvesting the potatoes, or until September 1st, whichever comes first. It's essential that you spray with the fungicide before the fungus is actually attacking your plants. So you need to get in there quick once you've heard your blight warning. Once you get it on the plants, it's too late. Another way of preventing the blight would be to remove the haulms before harvesting. So a few weeks before you harvest your potatoes, you generally burn off the growing shoots, and this tends to be around the time of year where blight is a big risk, and it helps to do a couple of things. It gives a little bit of time for the potato skins to harden under the ground, but also it reduces the likelihood that you're going to get blight at the end of your potato production. Now, so that's the potato blight fungus that we've just talked about. Let's come on to some pests then. The main ones are wireworms, slugs sometimes, aphids certainly, and the potato cyst nematode and eelworms. So wireworms eat into your tubers. They're quite common if you grow your potatoes straight after grass, and you prevent them by using poison baits. Slugs then eat into the tubers as well. You can get high numbers if you have a wet summer, and you kill them using slug pellets. Aphids or greenfly, a couple of things they do. They eat the plant, but also they carry viruses, and you control them by using insecticide. So if you spray an insecticide or a pesticide, it'll get rid of those. Or biologically, you could control them with ladybirds, which we mentioned in a previous chapter. And then your potato cyst nematode is one that can build up in the soil, and you have to be careful, therefore, to only plant your potatoes in a particular field 1 year in every 4, and not to plant potatoes after another comparable root crop that might have had potato cyst nematode in it. And you also ensure that you harvest all of your potatoes when you are harvesting. So there's a summary of some of the pests and the symptoms and the control. Weed control then. Crops are sprayed with a herbicide, a contact herbicide, when about a quarter of them have started to emerge. Now that contact herbicide kills all the plant tissue that it comes in contact with, but the potatoes will actually recover, whereas the weeds won't. The potato plants, once they get big enough, actually close over the gap between the two adjacent drills. So you see that little gap that we can see down the middle of the drills over here? So the little gap that you can see down here in between the drills, once the potatoes get big enough, they will actually grow over to close over that gap, and therefore there'll be no light down at soil level for any weeds that might like to grow there. So they control their own weeds once they get big enough. So what is this earthing up that I was talking about? Earthing up is carried out when the crop is about 20 to 25 centimetres high. So you've got your shoot up out of the ground and you've a few leaves on it. The machine that you'd use is called a ridger, and it deepens the furrows in between your ridges and then widens the ridges. What does that do? It gives more soil around the tubers that are starting to form in the ridges at that point, and that prevents those tubers, those actual potatoes, from getting any sunlight on them, because if sunlight gets at them, it will cause them to produce little chemicals called alkaloids under the skin, and that causes them to go green, and they're actually poisonous if they're green enough, and you're not allowed to sell them. So the advantages then of earthing up, it keeps the soil loose around them because you're removing a bit of soil from deep down in between the ridges over here. Where are we? Deep down here, you're removing some soil from there and you're using it to broaden out the width of the ridge. It prevents the greening of the potatoes, as I explained there, because the sunlight doesn't get at them. It stops annual weeds from germinating as well, because you're removing them, basically, the weeds that are in there as you're lifting them. And it can help to prevent disease like blight. Now the theory there is that when you put more soil up on top of the ridge, you are increasing the amount of soil that your fungus would have to go down through in order to get down to the tubers. So you're stopping the blight from getting down into the tubers if rain happens to wash it down off the leaves. And it can help to increase the yield as well. You're giving more soil to each of the tubers, basically, so more nutrients. Harvesting potatoes then. Early potatoes are harvested from May into early June, and that depends basically on the weather and where you are in the country and what variety you're talking about, whether it's a first early or a second early. The main crop potatoes aren't harvested until September or maybe even October, and at that point your tubers are fully grown. What are the stages in harvesting then? So first of all, burn off. That happens actually a few weeks before harvesting, so about 3 weeks before. You spray with a contact herbicide and it dries out and kills off the stems, or the haulms as they're called. The haulm refers to the whole shoot system that's above ground. The burning off of the haulms does two things. It prevents blight, so you've gotten rid of all the aerial parts of the plant, so there's nowhere for the fungus to land. And it also makes it easier for the harvesting machinery to get in and harvest the potatoes later. Stage 2 then is maturation. So you leave them for 3 weeks after you've burned off the haulms, and during that time the skin of the potato toughens and hardens up a bit, and that prevents it from getting too bruised or scratched when you're harvesting, because little scratches would be a place for bacteria to get into it during storage. Then lifting. So we can use an elevator digger to lift the potatoes, and when it does, it lifts them up, and then actually I think I have a picture of that coming in another one. And after they're lifted, they can be laid back onto the ground, or if you have a potato harvester, they'll actually be put into a storage bin. And then later you will store the potatoes. If you're talking about your main crop, they can be stored in a cool, dark, well-ventilated building. They tend to be sprayed with an inhibitor spray as well, just to stop them from sprouting if they're going to be, certainly if they're going to be stored beyond February. And they can be covered in straw to prevent any light getting at them and to prevent sprouting as well. So just to look at the two different things you can use for harvesting. The first one there is your elevator digger, and it lifts the potatoes from the soil and removes any stones, and then deposits back onto the soil, and then they can be hand-picked. And then the complete potato harvester, on the other hand, puts the picked potatoes into a storage bin, so you don't have to be walking along after it. You shouldn't be walking along after it anyway, health and safety wise. And then your yields of potatoes. Your first earlies give a low enough yield, 7 to 10 tonnes per hectare, whereas your second earlies give 12 to 15 tonnes per hectare, and then your main crop could be up to 30 to 40 tonnes per hectare. But as we mentioned, the first earlies there get a really high price, so they're still worth doing. An average potato in the main crop weighs about 75 grams of dry matter. 18 to 21% is what you're aiming for in your dry matter. A potato plant produces 12 tubers on average, so one plant can give you up to 12 potatoes, and the yield depends on the sunshine, which is why your Wexford potatoes are highly prized and tend to be sold earlier than any other potatoes, because they're grown in the sunny southeast. Now, lastly, we have to look at storage. If you're going to store potatoes for the winter, you need a building that is leak-proof and frost-proof, because you don't want water getting in there, because that's a lovely environment for your bacteria to flourish. You could cover them with a layer of straw to protect them against frost as well. You need it to be well ventilated. So if you are storing your potatoes in stacks, you're fine if your potato stack is, if the crates are stacked up to a height of maybe 1.8 metres it is. After 1.8 metres though, you need proper ventilation, as in you need to have an actual mechanical ventilation system, not just a drafty shed. And that is to force the air through, to make sure that the heat that's generated by the potatoes is driven out so that they don't sprout. These buildings tend to be made from reinforced concrete just to take the weight of them, and if you're going to be storing them all the way through for them to be supplying the market in March, April, May of the following year, you need it to be refrigerated at somewhere in the region of 4 to 6 degrees. If you're growing them at home, and you're probably going to have eaten them by the following January, you don't really have to worry about that because the temperatures are unlikely to have gotten up too high. You also, if you're a commercial grower, you tend to treat them with a spray called a sprout inhibitor, and that will prevent them from starting to sprout because you absolutely can't sell potatoes that are sprouted. That is the end of our potato chapter.